It's the Jude 23 community. I am Jeremiah Wood alongside Nick Hardcastle. And yeah, that's not how we normally start it, but let's try it again. It's the Jude 23 community podcast. It's clarity for those who are curious or confused about all things Christian. I am Jeremiah Wood along with Nick Hardcastle, and this is episode 16. So, Nick and I were just talking about how, because we typically record this on Monday nights, and whenever we record an episode, I asked Nick, I said, I wonder if the listeners or the viewers can tell how unbelievably exhausted I am anytime we sit down and do an episode, because it's usually late at night on a Monday. Kids have had practice, we've had dinner, did all the running around, and now sit down and do an episode. Yeah, it's good. Monday nights are probably the hardest night to do it, but like Nick said to me earlier, it's what we got. And yeah, we love doing it. So Monday nights it'll be. So hopefully hopefully I don't come across as too overly exhausted, because I am super pumped to be here.
Yeah, same. So happy to be here. But I think that you're not singular in that. So hopefully we'll pull this through the power of the Holy Spirit for the
Yes.
listener, for the viewer. But yeah, it's exciting to be back in here in the Word with you. You know, we're already into Genesis 13. Super excited about the story that we're going to get to talk about and see where really the Lord leads us with it. So I guess it's refreshing to us, at least, to be able to get on here and talk about this. So hopefully the listeners at least get some sort of refreshment out of hearing it as well.
Good. Good. We actually started recording this episode last week, and we got about 25 minutes into it, and all of our audio and video crashed. We actually, Nick and I live real close to each other in proximity, and our internet provider was laying new fiber optic lines for different neighborhood development that is going on down the road. And in the process of laying all that new fiber optic line, they happened to cut our fiber optic line. So we went several hours without any internet and didn't even finish the episode we got started last week. So we're just going to re-record last week's this week and pick up where we left off. Does that sound like a plan?
That sounds like a plan. If you hadn't have told them, they wouldn't have known, but we're all
That's all
on it
right.
together. Yeah.
That's all right. So, Nick, why don't you start in Genesis chapter 13, start in verse 5, and read through the rest of the chapter?
All right. I can do it. I've done it once. I'll do it again. Uh, Genesis chapter 13, verse 5. And Lot, who went with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And at that time, the Canaanites and Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. And if you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zor. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord. Then the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give you, and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust on the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Arise and walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord.
That's good. That's so good. So, one of the things that's going to be important about understanding tonight's lesson is that it is a stark contrast from where Abram was when he was in Egypt. If you want to know about Abram's whole story in Egypt, go back and listen to our last episode because it makes it very plain that, well, let's just go back there in chapter 13, starting in verse 8, maybe a little further back in verse 8. It starts that, no, it was verse 8. It says, From there, Abram moved to the hill country east of Bethel. He pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and worshipped him. And then Abram journeyed by stages to the Negev. Right? So Abram was in a place of worship. He was in a place of being led by the Spirit of God. And he was in a place of partnership with God. And then we have the whole Egypt debacle. Things got a little hard. Things got a little crazy. He became uncertain. And so he turned to self-preservation, right? So Abram started to get for himself what God had promised to provide and took matters into his own hand. As he was doing that, he continually began to spiral down in a downward spiral of just sin and self-sufficiency. And it ended up very, very badly for him. And then after the Lord brought him back out of Egypt, starting chapter 13, verse 1, it said that the Lord led Abram up from Egypt back to the Negev, he and his wife and all he had and Lot with him. And Abraham was very rich. Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold. And he went by stages from the Negev to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had formerly been. So when Abram repented, he went back to the place of worship and being led by the Holy Spirit where he had previously been. God had completely restored him back to that place. And so this is kind of where we pick up on the story because, again, there's two contrasting ideas here. You were looking at the Abram who was fleshly and carnal and self-sufficient going into Egypt, and now you have an Abram who is centered on God, worshiping God, listening to God, and following God in all things. And so let's kind of walk through what was happening in this situation. Nick, back at verse 5, Lot, who is Abram's nephew, the son of Haran, Abram's brother who died. Abram was not only rich, but Lot was rich also because of Abram, correct?
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah. One would also think that, there's a couple ways that I've heard this said before. The Lord's blessing was in abundance. So even those around Abram were being impacted by just the abundance that the Lord was providing Abram. But also one way to think about this as well, if you kind of give it some cultural context, is there's possibility that Abram was blessing Lot. So like whenever he went to Egypt and received all this, all these herds and all these cattle and all these servants and everything like that, there's probably a good possibility that Abram took that and blessed Lot with it as well, because Abram being the head of the household, or really the head of this family at this period of time, the items and possessions would have been under his to distribute and figure out where to go. So either way, you can see that the Lord's abundance was given to and shown on Abraham, and thus it kind of ended up in one way or another blessing Lot as well.
Right. And then something kind of wild ended up happening is they both had, Lot was being blessed because Abram was being blessed, because that was the promise from the Lord. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And Lot was being blessed because of the relationship that he had with his uncle. But now they were so blessed that they got into a problem. They had so many possessions that they could not stay together. So they were so rich that the land that they were in, staying together would not sustain them, right? So there was quarreling between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And if you see verse 7, it says, "And at that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land." And one of the points that we started to bring up last week was notice how there was not quarreling between Abram and Lot. There were quarreling between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen, but there was not quarreling between Abram and Lot. But Nick, let me ask you this. If your people are starting to grumble and complain and get upset with my people, and my people are grumbling and complaining and get upset with your people, it's only a matter of time until what happens.
Yeah, we're gonna take our people's sides most likely in this,
Yeah,
because they're the ones that we trust, and there'll probably be some division come out of it. So it kind of speaks a little bit even more about Abraham and some of the lessons that he's learned for him to get ahead of some of this as well. There was
right.
probably going to be conflict ensuing if he hadn't have acted in one form or fashion.
Yeah, and it's really crazy. Going on to verse 8. I'm going to come back to verse 7 because you brought something up interesting last week that I want to go back and hit on.
Yep.
But going on to verse 8, it says, "Then Abraham said to Lot, please let quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, since we are relatives." So this is a totally different Abram, right? With the Abram we saw go into Egypt, he was all about himself. Well, what about me? Who's going to take care of me? How am I going to survive? People are going to, kill me and try to steal from me. And here we see a different Abram. He's just like, hey, I don't want any quarreling between us. I don't want any. We are family, and we're the only family that we got. And I don't want anything getting in between us, and I don't want anything getting between our herdsmen and our households. Like, let's not have any of this. And so he immediately started coming up with some creative ideas on um, how to kind of solve the conflict. But what do you think, Nick? Like, how do you see the contrasting differences between Abram who follows the Lord versus Abram who follows the flesh?
Well, I think the one of the big things we saw is, honestly, he learned a lot from that situation. You can tell that he took a lot away because Abram, who follows the flesh, pretty much got in over his head. And he
Mm,
just let that take him by his own wild desires. Abram, that follows the Lord, was able to let his thoughts be sifted. And actually, out of that, he blessed others. He received, even though the Lord graciously gave him an abundance whenever he was still not following him. But he also actually learned from that he's not supposed to be the one necessarily receiving all this. He's supposed to be the one blessing others if he's really
hmm
participating in the work of the Lord. And I think that the most important thing about this is kind of like you hit on one thing, and I'll bring it up just in a second about family. But Abram let Lot choose, say, I'm going to be taken care of no matter what. I trust in the Lord, and He's going to take care of me. Um, I want you to take what you think is best. So he became selfless. He kind of died a little bit to himself, and allowed Lot to prosper at that point in time. He was able to kind of put himself in the back seat. And I think one important thing about that with family is this is probably a good story if you're ever focusing on, dividing up something with a family member. There's a lot of tension that can happen with it, whether it be an inheritance or, an equal share, an equal distribution of everything. Maybe it's like, kids and Christmas gifts.
mm,
If we really are trying to participate in the story of God, we should be able to at least put ourselves a little bit in the back seat and say, I want you to have what's best for you. because I care more about you than the abundance of my possessions and what I can get for myself. So I think this
Hmm.
story just really starts to resonate with me. This is a story really about families in a present day context, even of and how to handle these situations if we are trusting and walking with the Lord.
Yeah, yeah. I think that like what you were saying, that the two things that really get in the middle of family, right? Whenever there's a big family situation, it's either going to be selfishness, which Abram's really trying to avoid, or there is an outside voice speaking in one of our ears, right? And sometimes those outside voices is, I don't know, it's maybe where the conflict starts to begin. You think?
Yeah, an outside voice, or I mean, are you saying like an outside voice as in another family member, or an outside voice as in uh, a prompting from the world? You know,
Yeah, I mean, either or. I was kind of setting us up to go back to verse 7.
yeah,
When you read the Old Testament, specifically in Genesis, anytime that there's something there, it's never there by accident. It's always
yeah,
there to kind of lead you in a direction to say, like, maybe there's a little something more going on here than what we think. And so in verse 7, it says, at that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, how do you say that? Perizzites were living in the land. And so it looks like just another fly by night verse that you just read over and don't need to pay attention to. But
hmm,
there's something here that the author wants us to wrestle with, to notice, to kind of get a sense of. And as I was kind of thinking about this, you got a couple of things happening, right? You got two really rich outsiders who are taking up the land, like they're having a monopoly in the land, and they're nomadic, they're intense, they don't have a city, they're living out by the oaks, but their sheep and their cattle are consuming the plains, they're consuming the water. And I would imagine if I was a Canaanite or a Perizzite, that I would not be too happy with these nomads living in the land that we were living in.
yeah. I would imagine there caused a little bit of conflict with this, and that's why I mean, whenever I first read that, it kind of also prompted me at that point in time is, do we separate whenever there's outside influences, or do we kind of join in and get closer to one another? They could have
Mm-hmm.
continued to move about. It, in reality, there wasn't anything wrong with them being together.
Right,
Obviously, the Lord didn't tell them not to be together. There wasn't anything wrong with them separating, although there will be kind of some consequences about it later on.
right.
But the Lord just says, do whatever you need to do here. But yeah, there was definitely had to be some issues, I guess, with the locals who had already settled there.
Yeah,
Um, and there might have been honestly some external pressures from the Canaanites and Perizzites that were really just kind of bringing this tension between these herdsmen to a head at this point in
yeah.
time.
Yeah, and I think that that is probably what the case was. They probably had some little scheme that said, "Hey, if we can just get to fight with each other, maybe that will clear out the land and we can go about our own business." And so, while our while this theory is completely hypothetical, still the same. The truth is there that we have to understand, specifically when it comes to two things. When it comes to things like family, but when it also comes to partnering with God and doing the work that God has called us to do, there are going to be people, carnal people, who are looking to sow divisions among you. The
Mhm.
Apostle Paul talks a lot about this in the New Testament. He said, "Hey, there are people that are coming to intentionally sow division among you. Don't let them do it. Do not let them divide you, because a church divided can't stand." Jesus even said this: "A house divided against itself cannot stand. And so there is this necessity that we have to be able to stay unified as a family, and more importantly, as the people of God, who are in charge of the mission of God to see it. To see it through here on earth. And so it is. It's just interesting to me how a tiny little sentence could have so much meaning packed into it.
And meaning that we kind of honestly often just glaze over. But, also the funny part about it is, I guess if we hold true to this theory, the locals kind of let up after they had some relief from this entire massive two flocks and herds around. So because it shows that Abram did settle in Canaan with the
Mm,
Canaanites in verse 12. But one of these things that actually kind of pops up is maybe the division is really all they wanted to get at with it. They were okay with them being around because they were probably, if you thought about it, these Canaanites were probably coming out and trading, and they're also getting cattle and sheep from Abram and stuff like that. But
oh yeah.
maybe their agenda was able to work just enough to get what they wanted, and after that they said, okay, we'll back off and let you be for right now because we still need you in some form or fashion.
Yeah. Yeah. You got to be you got to be careful of what does Solomon say in Ecclesiastes, or maybe Song of Solomon's. You got to be careful of the little foxes. You got to be careful of those people who are going to come in and attempt to sow division among you. So be aware of that. Let's go on to verse 8 and 9. Then Abram said to Lot, please, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between, since we're relatives, or between our herdsmen, since the whole land is before you. Separate from me. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. And if you go to the right, I will go to the left, right? So Abraham is showing his hospitality here. He is showing graciousness. He is showing his, how do you explain it? He is showing his ability to want to do what is right. That's what I'm seeing from Abram.
Yeah, he's putting someone else above himself. In
Yeah,
current days terms, really for anyone who's a follower of Jesus, he's being Christ-like and allowing blessing to go to others and being the least. Um, but really, I mean, in that point in time, Abram had the decision to do whatever he wanted. So he made a conscious decision that it was better for him to bless than for him to take over. And I think one
mm,
thing that's kind of important in this, or at least something that was brought out, I think it was by Marty Solomon, was that at this point in time, uh, Abram likely thought that Lot was the person who was going to continue on his name, continue
yeah,
on the family name, because he didn't have a son of his own at this time. He
right.
would have been Abram's Behor. So that's why, he was given the blessing. He was given this. He was given his own herdsman, his own, and then he was given his own choice.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of see a father son relationship building here to where the father just wants the son to be blessed. And it could have been at his own expense. Um, he, Abram, might have prospered exceedingly. The other thing that kind of pops up here as well is I think that Abram did learn a little bit from going to Egypt about going to the city. And I believe it was in my archaeological background study Bible, NIV study Bible. It said that kind of the direction that Lot settled was in the region of 5 cities. Two of them were
Mm,
Sodom and Gomorrah, um, where it says in the direction of Zoar. But you see, Abram, I kind of wonder if given the option to choose, if he would have seen that lush plain over there between these 5 cities, if he would have actually gone in that direction, or really would have understood that the wilderness is where he's supposed to be. So I don't. There's not an answer to that. We really don't have any indication that he would have done otherwise. But I do think that it's really important to show that Abram is learning here. And the thing that he learned is he needs to be a blessing to others. And that's what God's
Yeah.
calling him to do.
Yeah, that's good. Let's highlight Lot just a little bit as because he's doing something very interesting. And it says in verse 10 that Lot looked out and he saw the entire Jordan Valley as far as Zoar was well watered everywhere, like the Lord's garden and the land of Egypt. So this is an interesting portion of the verse. We tried to talk about this. This is about where we ended up last week, and then all of our internet just went black. So we'll pick it up here. This there's again another contrast. You have the Lord's garden. What is the Lord's garden?
Garden of Eden.
The Garden of Eden, well watered, lush, fruitful, bountiful, perfect. And but it also looked like the land of Egypt, right? Now, this is painting for us the same picture that we have seen since Genesis chapter 1. You have the beauty of God's creation, God's command, and God's promise. And then you also have the temptation to be self sufficient. And so in the Lord's garden, you have Adam and Eve making a decision. In the Lord, this is outside the Lord's garden. Now you have guys like Cain and Abel making a decision. Are you going to make the decision to follow the promise, or are you going to make the decision to follow self preservation? And the more that all of that ends up taking place, the more we begin to see people. Let me rephrase that. The more that we begin to see people taking the route of self preservation, the more we begin to see self destruction in their life. It's almost like a self sabotage.
Yeah, I think honestly, what we see right here is these two things are hugely contrasting. I mean, these are really, if we think about, especially to the Israelites that we're hearing this story right here, Eden and Egypt, they're on the same level. I think what honestly could have happened at this point in time, though, is Lot was being asked to see if he would go into this land to uh, be like, make it like the garden of the Lord and participate
Mm,
in the story, to participate in the promise, to participate in walking with God, or if he was going to go in there and make it like Egypt and assimilate into the people that were there. If he was going to just be the anti-story, if he was going to live in the curse, if he was going to let the curse define him, or if he was going to be able to take this as an opportunity to spread God's kingdom. So I think
yeah.
right here we have just two opposite ideas. I'm just saying that the Lord didn't say going there was wrong, but it
No.
might indicate that he had an option to do or what he could do in that area.
Right. This is we'll learn this later on, probably next week, that Lot chose the Jordan Valley, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the valley is still part of the promise. It's still in the land. It's still out in the area where God had blessed them and given over to them to be. But as we'll see later on in the story, Lot slowly but surely makes his way into the cities, right? And what is kind of the picture of going into the city?
The picture of going into city is pretty much just accepting. Marty Solomon always says, empire, but I think our deal is taking on the curse, accepting the
Yeah.
curse as your identity. So that's what I'll say for us, and ours is choosing to live in the promise or accepting the curse as your identity. So going into the city for Lot was accepting the curse to be his identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. Just like when Abram went into the city, when he went into Egypt, he began to fail. Just like when we were reading like the Tower of Babel, they were trying to build for themselves, make for themselves the very things that God had promised to provide. It was also all of the just who I'm trying to think. My mind's blanking. Well, Cain. Cain was a builder of cities. Like he was a master at self-preservation, self-exaltation, and yeah, just resisting the very things that
He built
that
the
God
first
had
city.
promised to provide. He built the first city. He was the architect of this
Yeah.
kind of thing. And so Lot, even though being given a choice, there was something alluring that was drawing him closer and more intimately into the cities. But Abram had a different choice, didn't he?
Yes. He did choose largely different. And really, honestly, Abram chose to not move. If you really
Right.
look at it in verse 12, it says, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. So I think Abram is really contrasting him. You know, he said he would go to the right or left or take the opposite direction. I think Abram's honestly trying to wait for a prompting from the Lord to
Mm.
understand what's the next step, because he's kind of been told that he's supposed to be out here and dwell, and be a little bit of a nomadic herdsman, and the Lord will bless him. So he chooses the exact opposite. He stays out in the land of Canaan.
Yeah, and that's where the altar to the Lord was built. That's where
Yep.
Abram built the altar to the Lord, not just to worship, but also to remember. And Abram is making the choice to remember and stay centered in the will of God. And look what happens starting in verse 14. When Abram stays centered in the will of God and continues to worship God, it says, after Lot had separated from him, the Lord said to Abram, look from the place where you are. Look north and south, east and west, for I will give you and your offspring forever all of the land that you see. Which is really kind of feeling like some Lion King vibes, right? Everything the light touches, Simba. Yeah, it's good. And he says, I will give it to you and your offspring forever, all the land that you see. And I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. So get up and walk from one end of the land to the other, for I will give it to you. This is a really cool picture. And this picture is showing us that God not only wants to bless Abram with the land, but he wants to show it to him also. Like, let me show you how much of a blessing this is going to be. And let me show you how much I love you, how much I want to give you, how much that this promise is going to just live itself out. And so he's like, I want you to start walking. And he takes Abram on this journey and he just walks the perimeter of the promise. Like, let's just walk the perimeter of the promise. I'm going to show you everything that's yours and you can have it all. I think this is just such a beautiful picture because there's so many times that God wants to do with us so much more than oftentimes we're ready for him to do, because the things that the Lord wants to give us, it requires faith for us to be able to receive them. And it's not just faith to be able to receive them, but to be able to receive them the way that the Lord desires to give them to us. And oftentimes, the way that he desires to give things to us will be, they're not really in secret, but they're in surprises, right? Like somebody said one time that gifts from the Lord are kind of like an Easter egg hunt, right? They hide that the Lord hides treasures for us, and then desires for us to go out and find them, much like an Easter egg hunt. And I think this is what he's doing with Abram. But Abram has to have the faith and the trust and the worship to get up and to follow the lead that the Holy Spirit is giving him to go see the land that he is meant to receive.
And I think that it really just speaks to the fact that, um, you know, I guess what pops up in my mind is think about Abram walking around that land how excited would he have been? Isn't it just amazing? Like when the Lord reveals to us some of his plans, but then he says that we're going to walk down this path and we're going to understand more about it together. I mean, it should just bring a great amount of joy to your heart at that point in time, even though it could be overwhelming. Abram was probably sitting there saying, well, I don't know how I'm going to conquer Bethel and Ai and Jericho and all these other places. But the Lord's saying, I'm going to drag you out here and you're going to see all this. And it also
Hmm.
probably was a good test of faith at that point in time, because it probably brought a little joy, but it also probably made Abram a little bit nervous and saying, I don't know if I can take over all of this. I'm just one man by myself, right, Lord?
Hmm.
So it might have actually been a good opportunity for the Lord to bring him out and just show him how big of a God he is. It's like, you think going
Yeah.
to Egypt's good. Well, I'm going to give you all of this place.
Yeah, which is wild because it's almost as if the Lord's trying to show Abram, like, look, here's the promise that your offspring will be like the dust of the earth. They will be uncountable. But just so you can get a picture, let me show you how big the land is that your people are going to fill. Like you may not be able to see it, but you can see the land. And if I can show you how big your inheritance is, then maybe you could begin to understand how big the promise is that I've given you, that I'm going to fill it with your offspring.
Yeah, it's awesome. Um, and it's really just cool to show that the Lord goes and doubles down and says, at first he says, I'm going to bless you. And now he's saying, I'm going to multiply you. So the Lord's actually not just stopping on his promise to Abram, he's building on it every step of the way. Because
Yeah.
this promise that he gave him is the first time that he started talking about really just truly multiplying Abram's uh, family like the dust of the earth. So it just is
Yeah.
super powerful.
Well, and I don't know if you noticed this or not, but verse 18. So Abram moved his tent and went and lived beside the oaks of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. And so, what is interesting is this looks like another chiasm in chapter 13, because we started chapter 13 where he went back to live between Bethel and Ai, where he had built an altar to the Lord. And remember, an altar is meant to be a place of worship, but it's also meant to be a place of remembrance. And
Mm,
the chapter ends with Abram building another altar to the Lord, signifying again that he is building a place of worship and remembrance. And so, kind of the center point of all of this is that decision between Abram and Lot. Lot chose to make his identity in the curse and in the self sufficiency of the city. But Abram chose to keep his identity in the Lord. And by choosing that, he chose to worship the Lord, and he chose to remember what the Lord has called him to and what the Lord has promised him.
yeah. I think that's a great way to kind of to wrap this story up. But now I have a couple of questions off the top of it.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. Well, actually, first one's not a question. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. So the one thing that I liked that the Bible Project guys did said that the Lord is actually honestly often seen with trees, and that's where probably the start of this tree symbolism is like you have the Garden of Eden, you have the Oaks of Mamre, you have Abram meeting the travelers at underneath the trees. But I know at one point in time you started to bring up the pagans that were at the Oaks of Mamre. Do you have a little bit more wisdom and that you can kind of share with the listener on this? Because I really don't know much more than the fact that there was a tree worshiping cult, I think, out here.
Right. I don't know if I have very detailed. I need to read up on that just a little bit more before I have the answers. But I will say this, that oaks in the Bible are definitely associated with righteousness, right? The
Yeah.
righteousness of God and the righteousness of men. The psalmist says that you will be like oaks of righteousness, planted beside streams of living water, and even though the storms will come, you will not be moved. Even though famine will come, you will not be moved. You will be steady like oaks of righteousness. And I think that's a beautiful picture. The other thing, too, is you were talking about pagan cults that were worshiping tree gods among the oaks. And as we remember that the Torah was being written to people who had just come out of Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
and coming out of Egypt, and we won't even learn this until we get into Exodus, but when they were coming out of Egypt, all the plagues that God brought against the Egyptians were an attack on an existing god there in Egypt. And so when you had locusts, you had a god or a cult that served the locust god. And then you have frogs, and you had a cult or people who worshiped the frog god, or so on and so forth. And every single plague that was presented did that very thing. It put that God to shame, to show that Yahweh, the God of all creation, the Lord Almighty, is King of kings and Lord of lords, and he is above every other God. And so, yeah, just redeeming the oaks, even from the pagans, is a really interesting idea.
Yeah, lots of redemption. I think that they probably were blown away with Abram the further, because he stayed here for a little while. The one other thing, and you kind of hit on it just a second ago, we keep on talking about trying to remember the setting to which the Lord was telling the story, and it was getting told to the people of Israel the first time was them coming out of Egypt, right? And
Right.
they were delivering the Torah. So, what do you think when you read this story that the Lord was trying to tell his people? What message was he really trying to tell as a greater part of this story at this point in time with his people?
My best guess is probably when they were complaining about wanting to go back to Egypt. Probably around the time of manna, I would guess. And they were saying, well, at least in Egypt we had food to eat, and why did you bring us out here to die when we could have died in comfort back in Egypt? And I feel like maybe he is Moses and the Lord are painting a picture, contrasting, hey, your life is far better in the promise and in freedom than it is being in captivity to sin.
Love it. I was actually thinking the exact same thing. So, and I think that the Lord really was very creative whenever he started trying to say the land looked like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, are you going to trust me? Because I'll show you what happens if you go back. But
Right.
anyways, yeah, thanks for the extra couple questions. Always
Oh,
like to
yeah.
get a little bit more of that wisdom you have, Jeremiah.
Well, I appreciate that. And it all wraps up around the continued idea to trust the promise and trust the story.
Love it.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, that is all for us today. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you again next week on another episode of the Jude 23 Community Podcast. I'm Jeremiah, along with Nick Hardcastle, and this was episode 16.